everyone, and welcome back to the Wisdom by Harry YouTube channel. My name is Harry.
And I'm Mary. We're so excited to have you here today for another fascinating episode.
Okay, so today we're really diving deep. We're looking at the U.S. economy.
Yeah.
And specifically, how things are changing. It's kind of a big picture look at the national debt. And we're also going to talk about how trade strategy is shifting. Is there going to be a whole reshuffling of the global economy? And we've got some really interesting sources to dig into. One that takes us back to, before the pandemic and what the debt situation looked like then.
Right.
And then this other analysis that's looking forward, at potential global trade scenarios, kind of European perspective. And our goal here really is to help you, the listener, understand the key trends that are emerging, what are the big things to watch, and what are the potential challenges, but also, maybe some opportunities that could come out of all this.
Exactly. And we really want to keep it focused on those takeaways. What do these analyses actually suggest for the future, both in terms of potential risks, but also, where might there be some unexpected openings or advantages?
So let's start with the national debt. This analysis that looked at the period before the pandemic, one of the things that really stood out was just how much the debt grew under President Trump.
Right.
Even when, unemployment was low and the economy seemed to be growing, the debt relative to the size of the economy reached a level that we haven't seen since, World War II.
That's a striking comparison for sure. And the analysis really digs into the reasons behind it. They point to a combination of factors, particularly the tax cuts that were passed in 2017.
Right.
And then, maybe a lack of corresponding cuts in government spending.
So even before the pandemic hit, the U.S. was already in a position where it had less, what they called fiscal space to maneuver.
Think of fiscal space like your financial cushion, how much you can spend or cut taxes without raising red flags.
Right, without spooking the market.
Exactly. So when the pandemic hit, we were kind of starting from a weaker position than, we might have if we had less debt.
And it's interesting to think about this in a historical context. The analysis mentions that, other presidents like George W. Bush or even Abraham Lincoln, they also saw big increases in the national debt during their time. But those were usually tied to these big crises, wars, or in Lincoln's case, the Civil War.
Yeah, so what's different about the debt increase under Trump is that it was happening during a period of, relative economic stability. It wasn't directly tied to a major crisis or emergency.
And that suggests, a pretty fundamental shift, I think, in how we think about fiscal policy.
I think so.
And it does make you wonder, okay, if we're carrying this much debt, even in good times, what happens when we inevitably face another downturn or a real crisis?
Right. And it's not just about, the risk of not having enough borrowing power when we need it. It's also about how a large national debt affects the government's budget over the long term.
Okay, how so?
Well, more of the government's budget has to go towards paying interest on that debt, and that can squeeze out other priorities. Things like, infrastructure spending or education, scientific research.
I've noticed that even in recent years, there's been a lot of debate in Congress about how much of the budget is taken up by those mandatory programs like Medicare, Social Security.
Exactly. And as those programs grow and the debt grows, there's less and less room for what they call discretionary spending. That's the stuff that Congress decides on each year.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop of, record levels of national debt, even before we factor in everything that happened with the pandemic.
Right.
Now let's shift gears and talk about the trade picture and this whole idea of a potential global economic reordering.
Yeah.
This analysis from the European Parliament, it's pretty fascinating. It lays out this new approach to trade that seems quite different from what we saw from the previous administration.
Yeah, the focus before was often on shrinking those bilateral trade deficits, the difference in trade between two specific countries.
Right, like trying to get a better deal with China, for example, because we import way more from them than we export to them.
Exactly. And they often use tariffs to try to, make it more expensive to import from those countries.
Right, protect American businesses, that kind of thing.
Right. But this new approach, it's being led by people like Treasury Secretary Bessent and Stephen Marin, the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors.
Okay.
They seem to have a much broader goal in mind, which is to try to fix the imbalances in the entire global system.
So not just focusing on one-on-one trade relationship.
Exactly. It's about these persistent patterns where some countries always seem to sell way more to the rest of the world than they buy, and other countries are always buying more than they sell.
So it's like a fundamental rebalancing of the whole system.
Yeah, and the tools they're using go beyond just those targeted tariffs, although tariffs are still a key part of it.
Okay.
But they're also trying to influence the value of the dollar, how much it's worth compared to other currencies. And they're looking at the yields on U.S. Treasury bonds.
Okay, that's getting a little bit into the weeds.
Yeah.
But it's basically how attractive it is for other countries to invest in U.S. debt.
Right. And then, of course, there's the whole question of, how strong American industries are. Can they compete globally?
So it's a much more comprehensive strategy, and potentially, it could have a much bigger impact, for better or worse.
Right. And it's interesting how tariffs themselves are being used differently. In the past, it was often about protecting specific American industries from foreign competition. But now it seems like they're being used more as a way to pressure other countries.
Okay, how so?
Well, for example, they're putting tariffs on goods from China and the EU, which both have big trade surpluses. And the idea is that this will force them to revalue their currencies.
To make their currencies stronger.
Right. So then their goods become more expensive for us to buy, and our goods become cheaper for them to buy. And that could help to even things out.
So almost like using tariffs as this lever to force a reset of the global economy. It's a bold strategy, but it's also, potentially risky.
Yeah, absolutely. And the European analysis actually outlines a few different scenarios for what might happen next, depending on how aggressively these trade policies are implemented.
Right. So they talk about like a mild scenario where things basically continue as they are now with, maybe some targeted tariffs here and there.
Right.
And then there's this more aggressive scenario where they imagine a 20% tariff on all European goods coming into the U.S.
Yeah. And of course, that would probably lead to retaliatory tariffs from the EU, right?
Right. So what did their simulations suggest would happen in that kind of escalation?
What's interesting is that even in that more aggressive scenario, their models show that the EU might only see a small decrease in overall economic well-being, like a slight dip in real wages.
Okay.
But there's a catch.
Oh?
In a scenario where there are reciprocal tariffs, where the U.S. is basically matching whatever tariffs are put on their goods,
Yeah.
It's possible that EU exports to the U.S. could actually increase.
Really? How does that work?
It's kind of counterintuitive, but it all comes down to how trade flows shift around. If other countries are facing even higher tariffs from the U.S. than the EU is, then European goods might suddenly become relatively more attractive.
Oh, so it's like a relative advantage thing.
Exactly. So even in a more conflictual scenario, there could be some unexpected winners and losers.
Really highlights how complex this all is.
Yeah.
But they also talk about some even more extreme possibilities, right? Like a full-blown trade war.
Right. They discuss this scenario where, imagine if there's this Trump reciprocal tariff plan where tariffs are just escalating back and forth.
Wow.
That could spiral into a full-blown trade war and really destabilize financial markets globally.
That sounds pretty scary.
It does. That's definitely a scenario where the consequences could be much broader and more negative for everyone. But then, on the more optimistic side, they talk about this idea of a Plaza Mar-a-Lago Accord.
Okay, what's that all about?
So that scenario imagines that, maybe all this trade pressure eventually leads to this big international agreement on exchange rates. So major currencies like the euro, the yen, the Chinese renminbi, they would all increase in value compared to the dollar.
Okay.
And that could help to reduce the U.S. trade deficit.
Because our goods would become cheaper for other countries to buy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it would also reduce those trade surpluses in Europe and other places. So it would be this kind of managed rebalancing of the global economy through currency adjustments.
It's a pretty delicate balancing act to try to pull off.
Yeah, it is. And the European analysis is very careful to say, we don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
There's a lot of uncertainty.
Because, a lot of these trade measures that we're talking about are still just ideas. They're not actual policy yet.
Right. Even the tariffs that were announced back in early March, the ones targeting Mexico and Canada, those are still in flux. There's talk of exemptions and delays. And then, of course, you've got these potential global tariffs on steel and aluminum. And then there's the possibility of even more trade investigations, targeting things like the EU's taxes on digital services.
So things could change really quickly.
Exactly.
So for Europe specifically, what are the main things they need to be thinking about as they prepare for these potential shifts in U.S. economic policy?
The analysis suggests that, the European Central Bank, the ECB, and other EU institutions, they're going to have to play a bigger role in keeping the financial system stable,
Okay.
especially if things get really bad.
Like if we see a real breakdown in global cooperation.
Yeah, or if the U.S. starts, restricting access to dollar liquidity, making it harder for European banks to get the dollars they need.
Okay.
In that kind of situation, Europe might need to develop its own financial defenses. That could mean things like the ECB doing more swap operations, providing more liquidity to the markets,
Right.
strengthening the safety nets that are already in place, and better coordination between the different countries in the EU when it comes to fiscal policy, government spending and taxes.
So it sounds like Europe might need to become a lot more self-sufficient, at least in terms of finance.
Yeah, and the analysis also talks about the possibility of the EU deepening its own internal financial integration, maybe reconsidering their exchange rate policies,
Right.
and taking a more active role in global economic governance.
Wow. So it really feels like we're at this pivotal moment where, the global economy could be on the verge of some pretty major changes. And a lot of it is driven by what's happening in the U.S. with our debt levels and this new approach to trade that's really focused on rebalancing the whole system.
Yeah, it's a fascinating time.
And the European analysis, it really lays out a range of different possibilities for the future. From these small adjustments to, potentially really disruptive trade conflicts, and then even this possibility of a coordinated global realignment of currencies.
Right.
But the big takeaway is that there's so much uncertainty right now.
Yeah.
And, Europe and really the whole world needs to be prepared for a variety of outcomes.
Absolutely. We're so interconnected now that actions taken by one country, especially a big player like the U.S., can have these, ripple effects that we might not even anticipate.
So just to recap, we've seen how the U.S., even before the pandemic, had built up this huge national debt. And now we're seeing this shift in trade policy that's really aiming to shake up the whole global economic order.
Right.
It's a lot to take in,
It is.
but it really makes you think. If you think about how interconnected everything is,
Yeah.
how might these changes in U.S. debt and trade policy end up affecting people and economies all over the world?
Yeah, it's a really important question.
It is. It's something to really keep an eye on as these trends play out.
Absolutely.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
My pleasure.